It began, as most things in Clover Thorne's life now did, with a book. Specifically, a book titled Fungal Symbiosis in the Northern Tundra, a comprehensive analysis of mycorrhizal networks. Stellan was already asleep, his great chest rising and falling in a rhythm that was the only true indicator of peace in the entire kingdom. His wolf, a creature of war and shadow named Sentinel, was quiet for the first time in 18 hours. Clover's voice, however, was not. The arbuscular structures facilitate a nutrient exchange, primarily phosphorus, which is often a limiting factor in acidic tundra soil, she read, her own voice a low, steady murmur in the vast royal bedchamber. The oil lamps cast a warm, flickering glow over the tapestries depicting Stellan's ancestors, all of whom looked considerably less burdened than their descendant. "Are we done yet?" a voice in her head complained. It had the tone of a long-suffering roommate who had just been asked to take out the recycling for the third time. "I can feel my predatory instincts being replaced by a sudden urge to photosynthesize. This is abuse." Clover mentally directed a thought at her wolf, Briar. "He's asleep. That's the point. He's asleep." "I'm bored." These are two separate and unequal states of being. I am a wolf, Clover. I require meat and intrigue, not a detailed explanation of rhizomes. Clover ignored her and continued reading. This symbiotic relationship is crucial for the survival of dwarf willow species, which in turn provide essential ground cover and... She paused, listening to the quality of Stellan's breathing. It was deep, unbroken. Good, she could stop. She carefully placed the leather-bound book onto the nightstand, next to a stack of equally riveting tomes. A History of Tariffs in the Silverwood Valley, Advanced Masonry Techniques of the Third Age, and her personal favorite for emergency use, Lineage and Progeny of the Lesser Gentry, Volume 4. This was her life now. Mate to the Alpha King, Stellan Duskridge. A king whose reputation was forged in the fires of the Unification War. A wolf so powerful he had single-handedly broken the siege of Blackridge Peak. A man who, a year into their fated bond, was completely and utterly undone by a good night's sleep. Or rather, the lack of one. For 15 years, since the last battle, his wolf had refused to stand down. Sentinel paced the borders of his mind every night, a ghost on eternal watch. Stellan hadn't known a full night of dreamless rest since he was a prince. Then there was her, Clover Thorne. An Omega from a respectable but unremarkable family, the quiet scholars and landowners of the Thorne line, as opposed to her uncle's more ambitious branch, which had opinions about everything and approved of nothing. Her primary skills involved a preternatural ability to bake a perfect loaf of sourdough and a library-quiet demeanor. They had been mated for a year, a political and fated reality that the court had accepted with the grim pragmatism of a people used to their king making hard decisions. The bond had snapped into place the moment they'd met, a jolt of recognition so profound it had left them both breathless in the middle of a formal reception. His wolf had recognized her. Mate. Objective acquired. Her wolf had recognized him. Oh, great. A king. He looks like he'd have opinions about the state of the towels. The first few months were an awkward dance of duty and discovery. Then came the night that changed everything. Stellan had been awake for 3 straight days, the shadows under his eyes like bruises. He was irritable, his alpha aura crackling with a stressful energy that had the entire castle on edge. Desperate to fill the tense silence in their chambers, Clover had picked up a book of poetry and started reading aloud, mostly to herself. Halfway through a particularly dramatic ode to a lonely mountain, she'd noticed a change. The relentless pacing in his gaze had stilled, the tight line of his jaw had softened. His wolf, the ever-vigilant sentinel, had stopped his patrol. He was listening. Before she'd finished the second poem, King Stellan Duskridge, the wolf of Blackridge Peak, was slumped against the headboard, fast asleep. It was a miracle. It was a liability. It became the ritual. Now, every night she read. It didn't matter what. Fiction, history, seed catalogs. Sentinel didn't care about plot. He cared about the steady, uninterrupted sound of her voice. a living metronome that told him the world was safe, that the walls were secure, that someone else was on watch. She shifted, sliding down into the nest of pillows and furs. Stellan, even in sleep, gravitated toward her, his arm draping over her waist, his nose burying itself in her hair with a soft sigh. He was a man of immense power and crushing responsibility, but here, in the dark, he was just a tired wolf seeking warmth. "He smells like pine and ozone and poor sleep choices," Briar noted, her tone softening slightly. "And bread. Since you started leaving scones on his desk, that was a good call." "It's called strategy," Clover thought back, a small smile touching her lips. "It's called we were out of rosemary and you wanted to see if the royal greenhouse had any. Don't dress it up. The man is a walking tactical problem, and you are solving him with carbohydrates. I, for one, approve." Clover closed her eyes, letting the quiet of the room settle over her. She was a function, a key to a lock no one else could pick. Her wound, the one she never spoke of, was a quiet certainty that she was fundamentally uninteresting, easily overlooked. She'd spent her life perfecting competence as a shield. If you were useful, people kept you around. And right now, she was the most useful person in the entire kingdom. It wasn't love, not the way she understood it. It was a service. A necessary, intimate, and profoundly strange service. But as Stellan's hand tightened on her hip in his sleep, and Sentinel remained blissfully silent, Clover allowed herself to think that it was enough. It had to be. The gesture. The next morning, Stellan awoke to the unfamiliar sensation of being truly rested. The light filtering through the high-arched windows wasn't an enemy heralding another day of exhaustion, but a simple fact of the morning. His body felt solid, his mind clear. It was a feeling so rare he took a moment to simply lie there and analyze it. "Status report," his wolf announced from the back of his mind. The voice was crisp, devoid of emotion, like a field commander dictating a memo. "Subject sleep cycle completed. 8.2 hours. Uninterrupted. Threat level, minimal. Current mate proximity, optimal." Stellan's lips curved into a smile. He turned his head, his gaze falling on Clover. She was still asleep, her face half buried in a pillow, her brown hair a wild tangle on the fine linen. A book lay on her nightstand, its title something about fungus. He had a vague memory of her voice, a low and steady river of sound that had carried him into the deepest, most peaceful sleep he'd had in a decade and a half. He watched her for a moment. There was flour under her fingernails. There was always flour under her fingernails. She smelled of vanilla and old paper, and there was a small crease between her eyebrows, even in sleep, as if she were cataloging something in a dream. He wanted to smooth it with his thumb. He didn't. She looked too peaceful, and he was too aware that this peace, hers and his, existed because she spent every night reading herself hoarse for him. The thought landed wrong. It sat in his chest like a stone. He carefully, quietly, slipped out of bed and headed for the antechamber, where his beta, Keon Vance, was waiting with a stack of documents and a look of weary amusement. "Your Majesty," Keon said, his eyes flicking over Stellan. "You look less like a haunted relic this morning. Did the Queen read you the tax code again? I find it puts me right out." "She read about tundra fungus," Stellan replied, pulling on a tunic. "Apparently it's fascinating." "I'll bet," Keon deadpanned. He handed over the top document. "The goats have dislodged one of the western parapets and are using it as a sunning rock. I suggest we surrender and offer salt licks. They're better organized than half the baronies." Stellan grunted, scanning the report. "Send a gardener, with a fence. And don't let me hear about those goats again until they've breached the throne room." He paused, then set the document down. "Clear my morning, Keon." Keon's eyebrows shot up. "Clear your... Sire, are you feeling all right?" "I'm feeling well rested," Stellan said, the words strange and wonderful on his tongue. "And I have a romantic gesture to perform." Keon stared at him. "A romantic gesture? Sire, with all due respect, your last romantic gesture involved the Royal Corps of Engineers, a diverted stream, and the flooding of the lower dungeons. The dungeons are now surprisingly temperate thanks to the geothermal vents, Stellan countered defensively. This time will be different. Courtship Protocol Alpha 3. Demonstration of resource superiority. Plan approved. Sentinel confirmed. An hour later, Stellan stood proudly in Clover's personal library. It had been a small, cozy room. Now it was a testament to his logistical might. Every empty space was filled with books. Stacks covered the floor. Towers leaned precariously against the walls. He had commanded his scouts to purchase the entire inventory of every bookstore in the capital. Clover appeared in the doorway, a cup of tea in her hand. She stopped. "Good morning," Stellan said, beaming. "I noticed your reading selection was becoming limited." She took a slow sip of her tea, her gaze sweeping over the chaos. The structural integrity of these floorboards was only rated for light foot traffic and occasional furniture, she said, her tone perfectly even. "And the Dewey Decimal System is a lie." She pointed to a teetering stack. "That's biography on top of horticulture. Anarchy." Stellan's smile faltered. "It's a lot of books." "Yes," she agreed, "it is. I'm going to need more shelves." She looked at him, and for the first time, a genuine, unrestrained smile broke through her calm facade. It lit up her whole face, and it felt like the sun coming out. "And a bigger library. Thank you, Stellan." He felt his chest swell with a ridiculous boyish pride. He had made her smile. It was a victory more profound than any he'd won on the battlefield. Objective achieved. Mate appears pleased. "Initiate Phase 2, Sustained Proximity," Sentinel advised. Stellan stepped over a pile of poetry. "I cleared my morning schedule. I thought perhaps you might need help organizing them." Clover's smile widened. "Your Majesty, have you ever alphabetized anything in your life?" "I have alphabetized battle plans," he said with dignity. "That explains so much," she murmured, and took another sip of her tea. He was hopelessly, completely in love, and watching her start sorting books with the ruthless efficiency of a quartermaster, he knew the specific thing that was undoing him: the small crease of concentration between her eyebrows. The way she held each book for exactly 1 second, assessing, categorizing, deciding, before placing it with a confidence that bordered on judicial. She organized like other people breathed. He had commanded armies, but this woman could have reorganized his entire war campaign in an afternoon, and it would have been better for it. The problem was that he was increasingly certain she didn't know he saw any of this. She thought he saw the function, the voice, the solution to his problem. And the worst problem, the one sitting like a stone in his chest since this morning, was that he wasn't sure she was wrong. She spent 3 hours in a state of flow. She sorted by genre, then by author. She created piles for keep, donate to the pack school, and burn for being pretentious drivel. Stellan had tried to help, but his organizational method appeared to be based on cover color and spine thickness, resulting in a system that was aesthetically pleasing and functionally insane. After he shelved a treatise on siege warfare next to a collection of children's fables, she had gently but firmly dispatched him on a critical mission to procure more shelving units. He had taken the order with the solemn gravity of a general being handed a war-ending treaty and had marched off, presumably to terrorize the royal carpenters. By noon, the chaos had been tamed into orderly stacks. Feeling the familiar pull, she headed for the kitchens, the one place in the castle that felt entirely hers. The head cook, a formidable wolf named Martha, had long ago ceded a small corner to the queen. Here, she wasn't the king's strange nocturnal necessity. She was just Clover, a baker. She decided on lemon and rosemary shortbread. The rosemary was key. She grew her own on a sun-drenched southern balcony, coaxing pungent, aromatic varietals out of clay pots she'd brought from home. The royal greenhouse was adequate for most things, but rosemary was personal. Rosemary required attention. As she kneaded the dough, feeling the familiar give and pull, She let her mind settle into the work. This was where the world made sense. Baking was chemistry with better smells. You measured, you mixed, you applied heat, and something true happened. People were never this reliable. Recipes didn't change their minds about you halfway through. She had never been the prettiest, or the most charming, or the most powerful. She had just been the one who did the reading. Growing up, it had made her invisible, the quiet thorn girl at the back of the room who always had a book and never had a clever thing to say at dinner. Her uncle's branch of the family had produced politicians, military strategists, wolves of consequence. Her branch had produced librarians and gardeners and one truly exceptional cheesemaker. She had learned early that if you couldn't be interesting, you could at least be indispensable. If you were useful, people kept you around. Now, she was the most useful person in the entire kingdom. She was still deciding whether that was the same thing as being wanted. "The lemon zest is inadequate," Briar observed critically. "More. We want him to taste sunshine and victory." Clover added another scrape of zest. Her wolf's obsession with feeding Stellan had become a running campaign. Briar tracked his eating habits with the dedication of a military quartermaster. She knew his preferences: savory over sweet, anything with rosemary, an inexplicable weakness for shortbread, and his avoidances. He didn't eat the carrots at lunch, Briar noted darkly. Again. A king who won't eat his vegetables is a king who is begging for scurvy. We should hide them in the scones. We're not hiding vegetables in the king's scones. We're not hiding vegetables. We're strategically embedding nutritional content. There's a difference. It's called statecraft. Clover smiled despite herself and said nothing. Some arguments weren't worth having with a wolf who believed the path to political stability was paved with baked goods. She finished the shortbread, slid the tray into the oven, and stood for a moment in the warm, fragrant silence of her corner, listening to the distant clatter of the kitchen staff and feeling, for a small and specific moment, at home. The cold. It started, as so many catastrophes do, with a tickle in the back of her throat. Clover was in the middle of reading a dreadfully dry account of ancient water rights disputes when she felt it. She cleared her throat and continued, pitching her voice a little lower. Operational note. Sentinel's voice echoed in Stellan's head. He was half asleep, drifting on the current of her voice. Vocal pitch variation detected. Minor. Monitoring. Stellan shifted, pulling the furs higher. He was warm, safe. He didn't want to monitor anything. By the next morning, the tickle had blossomed into a full-blown winter cold. Clover woke up feeling like her head was stuffed with cotton. She sneezed, a small, undignified sound that seemed to echo like a cannon blast in the quiet room. Stellan shot up in bed, instantly awake. "What was that?" "A sneeze," Clover mumbled, her voice thick. His eyes widened. He scrambled over to her side of the bed, pressing the back of his hand to her forehead with the intensity of a battlefield medic assessing a mortal wound. "You're warm." "It's a cold, Stellan." "A cold," he repeated, as if the word were a foreign military code. "Pathogen detected. Subject is compromised. Initiate quarantine protocol 4B, containment and comfort." Within the hour, their royal chambers had been transformed into a command center for Operation Defeat the Common Cold. Stellan, who had delegated entire military campaigns, was now personally micromanaging every aspect of his wife's recovery. He had the royal healers brought in, 3 of them, because redundancy was important in a crisis. They took one look at Clover, prescribed rest and fluids, and were then subjected to a 20-minute debriefing on the exact nature of the virus, its projected lifespan, and potential complications. The senior healer, a woman who had treated battlefield injuries for 30 years, later told Keon it was the most thorough interrogation she had ever experienced, and she had once been captured by enemy wolves. He had the kitchen staff brew 3 different herbal teas, which he personally taste-tested for temperature and soothing properties, rating each on a scale he appeared to have invented on the spot. This one is a 7 for warmth, but a 4 for throat coating. Unacceptable. Try again with more honey. Less ginger. The ginger is aggressive. He had a perimeter established. No one was to enter the royal wing without express permission. A bewildered guard was posted with specific instructions to stop anyone carrying aromatic or potentially stimulating correspondence, by which Stellan apparently meant letters, because the smell of fresh ink might irritate Clover's sinuses. Keon quietly countermanded this order within the hour. He attempted to read to her. This lasted approximately 90 seconds. Stellan's reading voice, it turned out, was the voice of a man who had spent 15 years commanding troops, loud, authoritative, and rhythmically identical to a drill sergeant calling formations. He read a passage about a country meadow as if he were ordering it to hold the line. Clover lasted one paragraph before gently suggesting he was better suited to overseeing the tea situation. "He is trying so hard," Breyer observed, watching Stellan arrange and rearrange a selection of soups on a tray with the focus of a man diffusing an explosive. "It's like watching a wolf try to perform surgery." The instinct is correct, the execution is catastrophic. "Do you need another blanket?" he asked for the 5th time. "Is the ambient temperature satisfactory? I can have the engineers adjust the geothermal flow." "Stellan," she said, her voice raspy. "I'm fine. It's just a cold. I need to sleep." He looked panicked. Sleep is good, yes, an excellent tactical decision. He plumped her pillows with unnecessary force. "Rest. I will stand guard." "He's going to declare war on germs, isn't he?" Breyer mused. "I hope he gives a speech. It would be magnificent. We will fight them in the sinuses. We will fight them in the bronchial passages. We will never surrender." Clover pressed her face into the pillow so he wouldn't see her smile. It would only encourage him. That evening, the true crisis began. Clover's throat felt like it was lined with sandpaper. When nighttime fell and Stellan settled into bed, a knot of anxiety was already coiled in his stomach. Clover picked up a book. She started and winced. "The sun set over the sleepy town." Each word was a struggle, broken, scratchy. It wasn't the steady, soothing river he needed. It was a painful trickle. Analysis. Vocal stream is unstable, inconsistent. Cannot establish perimeter lock. Abort. "Abort," Sentinel reported, his usual calm cracking. Stellan lay in the dark, listening to her strained whispers. He could feel his wolf starting to pace, the familiar, agitated rhythm returning after a year of blessed silence. The shadows in the corners deepened. The wind outside became a potential threat. After 20 minutes, he couldn't bear it. "Stop," he said, gentle but firm. "You're hurting yourself." She set the book down, relief and failure warring on her face. She gave him a weak, apologetic smile and curled up on her side, falling into a fitful, congested sleep almost immediately. Stellan did not sleep. He lay awake, staring at the canopy, while Sentinel resumed his endless, frantic patrol. Every creak, every distant howl, every rustle was a potential threat. The peace he had taken for granted had been snatched away. The old, familiar exhaustion began to seep back into his bones. But worse than the sleeplessness was the thought that arrived with it, unwanted and sharp. She had been doing this every single night. Every single night for a year, she had read herself hoarse so that he could rest. She had organized her entire existence around his inability to function like a normal person. And what had he given her? Books she hadn't asked for, and a flooded dungeon. The second night was worse. She tried again, picked up the book with a determination that made his throat tight, and lasted 6 words before her voice dissolved into a cough that sounded like it came from somewhere deep and painful. He took the book from her hands, quietly, and set it on the nightstand. She didn't protest. She just looked at him with an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral, and failing. "It's fine," she whispered. "It'll come back." He nodded. They lay in the dark, side by side, not touching. The silence between them was different now. It had a texture, a question neither of them was asking. He could feel her awake beside him, her breathing careful and controlled, the way she breathed when she was thinking hard about something she didn't want to think about. Mate emotional state, distressed. Cause, unknown. Correction. Cause is known. Cause is us, Sentinel observed. The wolf's tone had lost its clinical edge. It sounded, for the first time, uncertain. Query. Are we the threat? Stellan stared at the ceiling and didn't answer. Beside him, Clover was doing mathematics. She was calculating how much of her life was built on this, on being the answer to someone else's problem. She was calculating the precise weight of being essential versus being loved, and whether you could survive on the first without the second, and how long she had been doing exactly that. The numbers were not encouraging. At some point before dawn, Stellan's hand found hers under the furs. She let him hold it. They didn't speak, they didn't sleep. But they held on, and in the morning, they let go at the same time, as if by agreement, and went about their day as if nothing had happened. It was the most dishonest thing either of them had ever done. By the third day, Stellan was unraveling. Not dramatically, he was too disciplined for that. But the edges were fraying. His eyes were bloodshot, his movements were jerky. Minor servants flinched when he entered a room, not because he was angry, but because his alpha aura had become an unpredictable crackle of exhaustion and guilt, and wolves could feel it in their bones. Kian watched him pace his study with the careful attention of a man observing a bear in a small room. "Sire, you need to sleep." "I'm aware," Stellan snapped. Then, quieter, "I'm aware." "So let her read to you. Her voice is coming back. It's rough, but—" "No." The word came out harder than he intended. Stellan stopped pacing. His hands were clenched at his sides. "She's ill, Kian. She's ill, and instead of resting, she stays up every night reading me to sleep like I'm a child who can't—" He broke off. The sentence had too many endings, all of them humiliating. Kian was quiet for a moment. "She's your mate. She wants to help." "She shouldn't have to." Stellan's voice was raw. "I've turned her into a tool, a sleep aid. That's not a marriage. That's a dependency." Self-assessment. Accurate. Subject is tactically dependent on a single point of failure. This is a strategic vulnerability. Recommendation. Unknown. Sentinel paused. The pause itself was unusual. Sentinel did not pause. Error. Recommendation file not found. Kian studied his king. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to sleep on my own," Stellan said, with the grim determination of a man announcing a siege. "In the East Wing, until she's recovered. She needs rest, not the burden of managing my broken wolf." Relocation to East Wing. Mate proximity, 0. "This is—" Sentinel began, then stopped. The tactical report didn't finish. There was no framework for what this was. That night, Stellan told Clover he would be sleeping in the East Wing. He said it was so she could rest properly. He said it was temporary. He said it very carefully, in the voice he used for diplomatic negotiations, which was the worst possible choice because Clover had spent a year learning every register of his voice, and this one meant he was lying about his reasons. "Stellan, you won't sleep," she said. Her voice was a gravelly whisper, but the concern in it was unmistakable. Not for herself, for him. "I'll manage," he said. "I managed for 15 years. "You didn't manage, you survived. There's a difference." She reached for his hand, and he let her take it. But she could feel the decision already hardening in him, the way his jaw set when he'd made up his mind about a course of action and would not be moved. She knew that jaw. She had read it to sleep 1,000 times. Please, stay. I can try again. My voice is almost... No. Gentle, but final. He squeezed her hand once and let go. Rest. Get better. That's the only thing that matters. He hesitated at the door. He looked like he wanted to say something else. He didn't. He left. Clover sat in the suddenly enormous bed and stared at the door he'd closed behind him. The room still smelled like him, pine and ozone and the particular warmth of a wolf who ran hot even in winter. The pillows on his side still held the impression of his weight. He thinks he's being noble, Briar said quietly. He thinks this is what love looks like. Idiot. Clover pulled her knees to her chest. She wasn't angry. She was frightened. Not for herself, but for him. She knew what those sleepless nights did to him, knew the look he got after 3 days, the way the shadows moved into his eyes and stayed. She had spent a year learning every symptom of his exhaustion because it had become the thing she most wanted to prevent in the world. And now, he was choosing it. Choosing suffering over what he saw as selfishness, because he was a man who had been trained by war to believe that needing someone was a liability. Underneath the worry, quieter and harder to name, was the old wound. The one that whispered, he'd rather hurt than need you. You are a tool that feels guilty about being needed. But the worry was louder. The worry was the thing that kept her awake that night, listening through the walls of the castle for some sign that he was sleeping, knowing she wouldn't hear one. She turned off the lamp and lay in the dark, and her first thought was not about herself. It was, he's going to be so tired tomorrow. In the East Wing, Stellan was discovering that nobility of intention was no substitute for a functioning nervous system. The room was fine. It was a perfectly adequate guest chamber, good bed, thick curtains, a fireplace that the servants had lit to a pleasant blaze. It had everything a person could need for a comfortable night's sleep. It had everything except her. And the absence of her was so loud it had its own frequency. He tried reading to himself. He picked up a book from the stack Kian had brought, something about agricultural policy, and read it silently, trying to replicate the drowsy calm of their nightly ritual. Sentinel was unimpressed. Self-administered vocal stream is not a vocal stream. That is just thinking. I am always thinking. It has never once helped. He tried counting. He tried breathing exercises. He tried the thing a healer had once suggested where you tensed and relaxed each muscle group systematically, starting from the feet. He got as far as his calves before Sentinel interrupted. What are we doing? This feels like preparation for rigor mortis. It's a relaxation technique. It is not working. Nothing is working. The bed is wrong. The room is wrong. The entire East Wing is wrong. Sentinel's reports were cycling now, faster, the crisp military cadence deteriorating into something frantic and recursive. Perimeter check, perimeter check, perimeter, mate location, West Wing, distance, 14 quarters, unacceptable, threat level, everything. Stand down, Stellan muttered into his pillow. Cannot stand down. Standing down requires mate vocal confirmation. Mate is not... Sentinel stopped, started again. Mate is... Another stop. The wolf was trying to file a report on something that didn't fit in any category he had. Mate is sad. The words arrived without tactical formatting, raw, unprocessed. Mate is sad because of us. Stellan pressed the heels of his hands into his eyes. I know. What is the protocol for this? I don't know. That is not an acceptable answer from a commanding officer. Then consider this my resignation, Stellan said to the empty room, and did not sleep. 3 nights passed. 3 nights of Stellan in the East Wing, each one worse than the last. The first night he paced. Sentinel paced with him. The two of them locked in a loop of restless motion, covering the same ground inside a room and inside a mind. At some point, around 2 in the morning, Stellan found himself standing at the window, staring out at the dark courtyard, and realized he was scanning for threats. Old habits, war habits. The courtyard was empty, except for a cat and the distant silhouette of the goats on their conquered parapet. Nothing was wrong. Everything was wrong. The second night, he tried exhaustion. He spent the entire day in the training yard, driving his body through drills until his muscles burned and his lungs ached. Surely, if he was tired enough, biology would win. He crawled into the East Wing bed, feeling like a man who had been beaten with sticks, and lay there, wide awake, while Sentinel cycled through increasingly fragmented reports. Perimeter secure. Mate absent. Perimeter secure. Mate absent. Perimeter. Why does it matter if the perimeter is secure if... Don't, Stellan said. The wolf went silent. The silence was worse. The third night, Sentinel stopped producing reports entirely. This was unprecedented. In 15 years, the wolf had never gone quiet voluntarily. It was the silence of a machine that had encountered an input it was never designed to process and had simply stopped. Every few minutes, a single, unformatted observation would surface in Stellan's mind, plain and stark. She is not here. And then nothing until she is not here. He moved through the days like a man walking through water, each step requiring conscious effort. His decision-making suffered. He stared at documents without reading them. In one memorable moment, he signed a trade agreement with the wrong name. Not someone else's name, but the name of a cheese. Keon quietly replaced the document and said nothing, which was the loudest thing Keon had ever not said. Keon handled everything with the quiet competence of a beta who had been running this kingdom by proxy for 15 years and was very tired of it. On the third morning, he cornered Stellan in the study. "Sire, how much longer?" It wasn't a question. It was a countdown. "She needs to rest," Stellan said, which was the thing he kept saying, as if repetition would make it true. "She needs to get better without the pressure of what? Of being near her own husband?" Keon's voice was careful, but the patience in it had worn thin enough to see through. "She is baking bread at 3 in the morning, sire. The servants are running out of places to put it. The hounds are refusing sourdough. The hounds, sire, they eat boots." Stellan said nothing. "You're not protecting her," Keon said, quieter now. "You're protecting yourself from feeling guilty about needing her. And she's paying for it." The words landed like a blade, clean and precise. Keon had always been able to do that, find the exact place where the armor didn't quite meet and put a sentence through it. And Clover baked. She baked the way she always did when she couldn't fix something, with precision and purpose. But this wasn't angry bread. This was worry bread. Every loaf was a question she couldn't ask out loud. Are you eating? Are you sleeping? Are you all right? The first morning, she wrapped 2 rosemary scones in a cloth napkin and left them outside the East Wing door before dawn. She didn't knock. She just placed them on the stone floor where he'd find them when he opened the door, still warm, with a small sprig of rosemary on top because she knew he liked the smell. She walked away before he could wake and find her there. He found them. She knew because the napkin came back to the kitchen, folded carefully, and not a crumb remained. The second morning it was scones again, and a small pot of the herbal tea the healer had prescribed for him, kept warm in a clay jug she'd wrapped in towels. She added a shortbread, the lemon and rosemary kind, his favorite. No note, no explanation. Just food, left like an offering at a temple door. "He's not a stray cat," Briar observed. "You can't domesticate him back into the bedroom with baked goods." "Watch me," Clover thought. That's actually not what I was going to argue against. Carry on." By the second day, the baking had escalated beyond the deliveries. She was producing bread at a rate that alarmed the kitchen staff. 47 loaves of sourdough, 3 dozen scones, 2 trays of shortbread, a truly magnificent focaccia that reduced one of the junior cooks to tears. Martha, the head cook, watched from a safe distance. She'd seen worry baking before. It was common among wolves, the need to feed something when you couldn't fix it. But the scale of this was unprecedented. The queen was baking like a woman trying to hold the world together with flour. She hasn't slept, Briar noted on the second night. Neither has he. You are both being idiots in perfect symmetry. It would be romantic if it weren't so exhausting. I'm worried about him, Clover thought. I know, that's what I'm saying. You're worried about him, and he's worried about you, and neither of you is talking to the other, and meanwhile I am trapped in the middle of this with nothing but the smell of sourdough and a profound desire for someone in this relationship to say a true thing out loud. Her voice was coming back. Not fully, still rough, still a shadow of itself. But words were possible. She had been testing it in the kitchen, murmuring instructions to the staff, reading labels on spice jars. The mechanics worked. The willingness to use it for anything that mattered was another question entirely. On the second night, she couldn't stand it anymore. She got out of bed, wrapped herself in a robe, and walked to the east wing. 14 corridors. She'd counted them the first night, lying awake, trying to calculate the exact distance between her heartbeat and his. The stone was cold under her bare feet. She stopped at his door. She could hear him inside, not sleeping. The restless creak of a bed frame under a man who couldn't be still. A muffled conversation with himself, or with his wolf, she couldn't tell. She pressed her hand flat against the oak and stood there, listening. And what she felt was not her wound, not the old fear of being disposable, but a simple, enormous, ungovernable tenderness for a man who was suffering because he loved her wrong and didn't know how to love her right. She didn't knock. She wasn't ready. He wasn't ready. But she stayed for 20 minutes, her hand on the door, breathing quietly, and she hoped that some wolf part of him could feel her there. Go in, Briar said. Not yet, Clover thought, but soon. She walked back to their chamber, and on the way, she passed the kitchen and made one more batch of scones for the morning. These ones she shaped carefully, each one the same size and weight, because precision was the language she spoke when words wouldn't come. On the third day, she found one of his tunics folded on a chair in their chamber. He must have come to collect something while she was in the kitchen. She picked it up. It smelled like him. Pine and ozone, and underneath that, the particular scent of a wolf who was not sleeping, which was sharper, more metallic, like a blade left out in the rain. She folded it carefully and placed it on his pillow, and then she sat on the edge of the bed and held his absence like a physical thing, and the old wound whispered underneath the love. What if he's right? What if needing someone is a weakness? What if the best thing you can do for him is become unnecessary? That, Briar said firmly, is the stupidest thing you have ever thought. And you once considered alphabetizing your spice rack by Latin name. He is not right. He is a man who has confused love with strategy and guilt with honor. And he needs you to tell him he is wrong, because no one else in this entire castle has the nerve. Clover said nothing, but she didn't put the tunic away. And that night, she went back to his door again. On the fourth night, Stellan cracked. He didn't plan it. He was lying in the east wing, staring at the ceiling, and Sentinel was no longer producing tactical reports. The wolf had gone quiet in a way that was worse than the frantic cycling. It was the silence of a system that had given up trying to categorize its own failure. Every few minutes, a single line would surface. Mate is 14 corridors away. And then nothing. Stellan got up. He walked barefoot through the dark castle. 14 corridors of cold stone, past sleeping guards who pretended not to see their king wandering the halls in his sleep clothes at 3 a.m. He stopped at their bedroom door. He didn't go in. He sat down on the floor outside it, his back against the wall, and he listened. He could hear her breathing through the heavy oak. Slow, steady, awake. She was awake. Of course she was. On the other side of the door, Clover heard him. She had spent a year learning the particular frequency of his presence, the way the air changed when he was nearby, the way Briar went quiet and alert, the way her own pulse did something she refused to name. She knew he was there. She knew he was sitting on the floor. She knew, because she knew him, that he had come not to knock and ask to come in, but to be close enough to hear her breathe. She almost smiled. She had been doing the same thing. 2 nights now, standing outside his door in the east wing, her hand on the oak, listening to him not sleep. They had been circling each other in the dark like 2 wolves too proud to howl. She pressed her hand flat against the door, at roughly the height where his head would be, and she thought, "Come home. Just come home. I'll figure out the rest." He pressed his head back against the stone and closed his eyes, and Sentinel, for the first time in 4 days, produced a coherent report. Mate proximity? Close enough. It's not enough, but it's something. He slept. 40 minutes, sitting on a cold floor outside his own bedroom, and it was the best sleep he'd had since she got sick. He woke with a crick in his neck and the absolute certainty that he was the biggest fool in the history of the Duskridge line, and the competition for that title was fierce. Clover found him in the morning, or rather, she opened the door and nearly tripped over him. He was still sitting against the wall, awake now, looking up at her with the expression of a man who had prepared a very dignified speech and had just been caught in the least dignified position imaginable. His legs were stretched across the corridor. One of his socks was missing. She could see it balled up 3 feet away, as if it had made a break for freedom during the night. His hair looked like it had been styled by a strong wind and a grudge. "Oh," Briar said. "Oh, he is pathetic. I love it. Don't let him up yet. This is the best thing I've seen in weeks." "You slept out here," Clover said. Her voice was rough gravel, but it worked. "I did." "On the floor." "The floor is surprisingly—" No, it's terrible. It's stone. My spine may never recover." He shifted, wincing. Something in his lower back made a sound that was not encouraging. "I think the cold may have permanently fused 2 of my vertebrae." She looked at him. She looked at the missing sock. She looked at the way his hands were resting in his lap, palms up, as if he'd fallen asleep in the middle of surrendering. There was a red mark on his cheek from where he'd pressed it against the stone wall. And his eyes, God, his eyes. They were so tired they were almost transparent, and they were looking at her with the raw, unarmored expression of a man who had run out of strategies. Tactical assessment. Subject has been located by mate in suboptimal position. Dignity status, compromised. Sock status, absent without leave. Recommend, Sentinel paused. Recommend honesty. All other options exhausted. "I can explain," he said. She didn't lean against the doorframe. She didn't cross her arms. She sank down to the floor beside him, her back against the wall, close enough that their shoulders touched. It was the first time they had been this close in 4 days, and the contact, even through layers of cloth, felt like a circuit completing. "You're an idiot," she said softly. "I've been coming to your door too, the 2nd and 3rd nights. I stood outside for 20 minutes each time." He turned to look at her, something stunned breaking through the exhaustion. "You. I left you scones every morning. Did you think they appeared by magic?" He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "I thought, Keon, maybe, or—" "You thought Keon was baking you rosemary scones at 4 in the morning? The man who once tried to make toast and set off a castle-wide alarm?" A sound escaped him, somewhere between a laugh and something that might have been a sob if he'd been less disciplined. He pressed his hands over his face. "I've been so stupid." "Yes," she agreed. Then, quieter, her voice cracking not from the cold, but from something that had been building for 4 days. "You left because you thought you were being selfish. But Stellan, I was never doing it because I had to. I was doing it because I couldn't bear to watch you not sleep. Because every night I read to you, I got to be the person who made the most tired man in the world feel safe. Do you know what that's worth? Do you have any idea what that meant to me? The silence that followed was its own creature. It sat between them in the corridor, large and unavoidable. Tactical assessment. Subject has said the thing. Outcome uncertain. Heart rate elevated. Recommend remaining on floor as submissive posture indicates non-threat, Sentinel reported, his formatting partially restored but wobbling. He took his hands away from his face. His eyes were wet, which she had never seen before, and the sight of it cracked something open in her chest. I thought I'd turned you into a function, he said, his voice rough. A tool. I was terrified that I'd confused being needed with being wanted, and that you had too. You did confuse them, Clover said, but not the way you think. She reached over and took his hand, deliberately, not as comfort, but as a choice. Being needed by you is the best thing that's ever happened to me. Not because I'm useful, because you trust me. Because the most guarded man in the kingdom lets me see him with his defenses down. That's not dependency, Stellan. That's love. And you tried to take it away from both of us because you felt guilty about deserving it. The crease appeared between her eyebrows, the one he loved, the cataloging crease. But this time she wasn't cataloging. She was holding steady. He reached out and smoothed it with his thumb, gently, like it was the most important thing he would ever do. I don't need your voice, Clover, he said. I need you. In the bed, next to me, even if you never read another word, even if Sentinel never sleeps again. I would rather be tired every day of my life than spend another night 14 corridors away from you. Confirmed, Sentinel said. And for once, that was all he said. Then come home, she said, and eat your vegetables. Briar has opinions. He laughed. It was an exhausted, broken, beautiful sound, and it echoed down the empty corridor. She leaned into him, pressing her forehead against his shoulder, and his arms came around her with the desperate, full-body relief of a man who had been holding his breath for 4 days. She held him back just as hard. We're keeping him, Briar said definitively. He's an idiot, but he showed up. Well, he showed up at the wrong door, but we were at his door too, so the moral high ground is questionable. Also, he's very warm. That night, they rebuilt the ritual from scratch. Clover sat propped against the headboard, Stellan's head in her lap. She picked up a book, the terrible tundra fungus one, because it felt right, and opened it. Her voice was still rough, still a shadow of its former self. It cracked on every third word. The steady, perfect stream that Sentinel needed was gone, but Stellan was already heavy against her, his breathing slowing, not because of the words, but because of the weight of her hand in his hair, the warmth of her thigh under his cheek, the specific and irreplaceable fact of her. Mate proximity, optimal, Sentinel reported. Vocal stream, degraded but present. Query, is vocal stream the relevant variable? The question sat in the quiet of Stellan's mind. For 15 years, Sentinel had been a machine of assessment and vigilance. He had never once questioned his own methodology. Recalibrating, Sentinel announced. New perimeter definition, mate presence. Vocal confirmation, preferred but not required. Primary security variable, she is here. Stellan smiled against her leg. He was already half gone. Clover read 3 more sentences about phosphorus exchange before she noticed his breathing had changed. Deep, even, peaceful. She stopped reading and simply sat there, one hand in his hair, watching the oil lamps throw soft shadows on the walls. We did it, Briar said, without even getting to the chapter on lichen. Clover looked down at her sleeping king. His face, for once, was completely smooth. No tension, no vigilance, just rest. She had spent her whole life believing she was a function. That her value was in what she could do, not who she was. And maybe that would always be the scar. the place where the old wound had healed but left its mark. But sitting here, in the quiet dark, with a man who had chosen the cold stone floor over one more night of letting her believe she was dispensable, she thought maybe the scar was just a scar, not a prophecy, not a definition, just a thing that had happened and was healing and didn't have to be the whole story. She closed the book. She turned off the lamp. She slid down beside him, and his arm came around her waist immediately, a reflex so deep it lived below consciousness. "Good night," she whispered to the dark room. "Good night," Briar yawned. "Tomorrow, we're making cinnamon rolls. The enormous, obscene kind. As a victory celebration." In the morning, she would bake. Not angry bread. The crisis bread had served its purpose, and the castle's flour reserves were still recovering. She would bake something precise and beautiful. Something that required patience and exact temperatures. Something that existed not because it was needed, but because she wanted to make it. He would eat whatever she put in front of him with the reverent attention of a man who had learned, the hard way, not to take small things for granted. He would sit in the kitchen and watch her work. Not because he was useful there, he was categorically useless there, but because he liked the crease between her eyebrows when she measured, and she had stopped pretending that didn't matter to her. Keon would say something cutting about the state of the royal correspondence. Sentinel would file a report. The goats would continue their siege, unbothered by the emotional dramas of the wolves whose castle they had claimed. The kingdom would go on, imperfect and alive, held together by the usual combination of stubborn loyalty, geothermal engineering, and an unreasonable quantity of baked goods. But tonight there was just this. 2 wolves, quiet at last, in a room that smelled of old paper and vanilla and home. Not a perfect home, not an easy one, but one they had chosen and were choosing and would keep choosing, even when the voice cracked and the floor was cold, and the only language they had for the biggest thing they'd ever felt was a book about tundra fungus and the steady warmth of a hand that didn't let go.